Episode 1, the page that wasn't supposed to be there. They said the Bible was complete. They said God doesn't make mistakes. But Father Elijah knew something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. It began with a foreigner in hell, but in a convent library, buried beneath centuries of silence. The fire didn't spread. It didn't consume shelves or echo screams. It ignited only one thing, a single Bible, centuries old, untouched by time. Until that night, when the fire was put out, the Bible remained, charred at the edges, open to a page that was never meant to exist. No chapter, no verse number, no annotations in the margins. Just one sentence, handwritten in ink that shimmered like dried blood under candlelight. And on the seventh day, he wept because he had written what should never be read. Father Elijah didn't believe in heresy. Until that moment, he took the Bible back to his chambers, away from the nuns, away from the sisters, who had already begun whispering about the screams they heard from the fire, though no one had been inside. That night, he had locked his door, bolted the windows, lit a single candle, and opened the book again, but the sentence had changed. Now a read. He wept because one would read it again. Elijah dropped the book, but it couldn't stop staring. It was no longer just ink. It was pulsing, breathing, a verse that responded, a verse that knew. He reached for his rosary, but when he touched the beads, they were wet. Tears, not his. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't pray. He watched the candle flicker and listened to something breathing beneath the floorboards. I'm mourning. The Bible was gone, but the verse had etched itself onto his mirror, written backward, as if not meant for the world of the living. He scrubbed it, painted over it, smashed the glass, but every night it returned, and with it, a new word added to the sentence. By the seventh day, it would be complete. By the seventh day, he wouldn't be alone in his room anymore. Episode 2, the whisper beneath the font. The baptismal font hadn't been used in months. No children were born in the village. No one came to convert, and those who tried left before the sermon ended. But on the second night after the verse appeared, Father Elijah heard water slushing, not dripping, slushing. He followed the sound through the church's stone halls. The air grew cold, though the lamp still burned. A strange humming tickled his ears like a choir rehearsing in a dead language. When he reached the font, the room was empty, but the water was moving. He stepped closer. What he saw was impossible. Inside the font, letters floated just beneath the surface. Not reflections, not ink, floating as if the water had memory or a message. He leaned in, and something spoke from beneath the waternet with words, but with no ink, like a thought pressed against his skull from the inside. He wrote it with a broken hand. Elijah stumbled back. The water stopped. He looked again. The letters were gone, but now the stone bowl bore a crack, one that hadn't been there yesterday. And from that crack, something black seeped into water. Not blood, but silence. Silence so thick it ran in his ears. That night, Father Elijah didn't go to his room. He stayed in the chapel beside the font, whispering prayers, but the prayers didn't echo. They were swallowed as if something beneath the church was listening and choosing what to hear. Just before dawn, the silence broke, not with sound, but with a breath, warm, damp, against his neck. He turned. No one was there, but on the wall behind him, written in condensation, was the next line of the verse. He regretted it, not because it was wrong, but because it was read by the wrong soul. Elijah stared at the words until they evaporated, and he realized something that made his knees buckle. The verse wasn't finished yet, but someone else had already read it. Episode 3, the child who spoke in verses. They brought the boy to Father Elijah just after dawn. He hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since the fire, not since he wandered into the ruined convent on his own, and came back with eyes that wouldn't blink. His name was Samuel, 7 years old, hair matted with ash, lips dry and cracked. But when they entered the chapel, and the font came into view, Samuel lifted his head and began to whisper, not in words, in verses. Verses no one had taught him. Verses not in any scripture. Verses that made the crucifix on the wall begin to tilt. Father Elijah knelt in front of him. Samuel, he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Who taught you that? The boy tilted his head, like he was listening to something just behind the priest's voice. Then he spoke. He wrote it on the seventh day and tore the sky where the ink touched. The room went still. Even the candles seemed to hold their breath. Samuel reached out and placed his fingers on Eliah's chest, just above his heart. One word left, the boy said, then the verse will bleed. That night, Father Eliah didn't sleep. He placed the boy in the old confessional only because he couldn't risk putting him near the holy text again. But the church did not rest. At 3 a.m., the bells rang. No wind, no hands, just sound booming, broken, hollow, like the church itself was mourning. Eliah ran back to the chapel. The candles had all gone out, but in their place, on the floor beneath the altar, the final line was written in ash, and the one who reads it aloud shall finish what even God dared to abandon. He didn't dare speak it, not yet, but behind him, the child began to hum the same melody Eliah had heard beneath the font. Low, soft, like a lullaby sung in reverse, and from the confessional, the whisper started again. Only this time, it was in Eliah's voice. Episode 4: The Priest Without a Shadow. They found his cassock folded neatly on the pew, but Father Eliah was not inside it. No blood, no struggle, just silence and an outline of ash where he once Saturday, as if he had been burned by something that left no fire. Yet he walked into the church later that morning, or rather, something that looked like him did. Same voice, same posture, but when the sunlight from the stained glass windows touched his feet, there was no shadow. Sister Mirabelle was the first to notice. She dropped her rosary. It clattered like broken teeth across the marble floor. Eliah, she whispered. He turned to her slowly, smiled, and that smile was not the one she remembered. It was too calm, too perfect, the kind of smile you see on statues that weep blood. Eliah is still praying, he said, but I am listening now. He walked past her. The candles lit as he moved, one by one, without flame. In the confessional, Samuel had stopped whispering. He stared through the lattice as the thing wearing Eliah's face entered. What are you? The boy asked, his voice suddenly firm. The reply was not spoken. It was felt. The wooden walls of the booth pulsed like lungs. The smell of frankincense turned sour, and the air around them grew so thick. The desks began to fall upward. The finale of voice came. It was Elias, but hollow, empty of soul. A verse written in regret becomes a door, and I am what walks through it. That night, every mirror in the church cracked, every crucifix twisted slightly, and the holy water turned gray. In the morning, they found Sister Mirabelle sitting in the chapel, eyes wide open, unmoving, not dead, not asleep, just stuck. And on the wall behind her, written in her handwriting, he does not cast a shadow because regret has no form. The verse had taken another, and it wasn't done. Episode 5: The verse inside the Virgin's womb. She had never touched a man, never kissed one, barely spoke to them. Even Sister Romara was known for her purity. But purity, it seemed, did not protect her from prophecy. It began with pain, not the usual aches of fasting or prayer on cold stone floors. This pain bloomed from her spine, twisted, bloomed again. She screamed once, only once, and from that moment forward, something moved inside her. The other nuns said it was madness, possession, the echoes of the boy's whispers, infecting even the most devout. But Amara insisted, it's not the devil, it's not God, it's a verse, and it's alive inside me. Father Eliah wore his skin ordered she be kept in the infirmary, but the room grew colder each night she remained. Holy oil frownsy in his phial. Every cross above her bed began to tilt downward, toward her stomach, and one morning, the sheets beneath her revealed a message written in blood. When the verse is born, it will speak only once, and the world will have to choose between heaven's silence or hell's answer. They tried to move her. They failed. The air around her resisted touch, like glass that hadn't yet shattered. One priest dared to approach with a relic once said to cast out 7 demons. He never reached her. He stopped mid-step, mouth agape, whispering, I hear it, behind my eyes. He clawed at his own face until his vision bled. Then he wept, not for himself, but for the child she had not yet given birth to. That night, Sister Amara awoke without pain. She looked down, and on her stomach, written in raised flesh like a scar carved by Scripture itself, was the next line. The verse is no longer written. It is waiting to be delivered. And outside, the church bells rang once again, though no one had touched them. Only this time, they ran in reverse. Episode 6, the Midnight Mass where no one prayed. They came, not because they believed, but because they were afraid. Every villager, every skeptic, every lapsed soul returned to the church that night, drawn not by faith but by the fear of what was coming. They called it Midnight Mass, but no hymns were sung, no candles were lit, no priest stepped forward to speak. Instead, the congregation sat in silence, watching the altar like it was a mouth about to open. Father Eliar, the faint inside, and stood behind the pulpit, but he did not bless. He did not read from the book. He simply placed one item on the altar, the cracked mirror from his chamber. Its surface was smeared, smudged, but from where they sat, the people could see something shifting beneath the glass, something that was trying to come through. The pews groaned, the air buzzed, thick with the scent of burning parchment. And then, the child spoke again. Samuel, seated at the very front, stood without permission, eyes closed, hands raised, and from his mouth came a voice that was not his. The verse is almost full. A womb stirs, the shadow grows hungry. People began to murmur, cross themselves, whisper prayers too broken to be heard. But none of them noticed Sister Emerald. She walked down the center aisle, barefoot and calm. Her belly pulsed beneath her robes, as if something inside her had begun to breathe. No one moved, not even when the mirror cracked again, this time spilling a trail of black ink down the altar steps. Eliar reached for her, or the creature in this form did, but she did not stop. She walked straight to the altar and spoke. The verse is not meant to be destroyed, only finished. As her hands touched the mirror, the ink surged upward, not spilling, but forming letters that wrote themselves in the air. And in the final second, before the glass shattered, everyone forgot how to pray. Episode 7, the night God refused to watch. There are nights when heaven listens, and nights when it turns away. This was the second kind. The moment the mirror shattered, something ancient fled the church. The stained glass windows didn't break. They melt, dripping colors like tears from forgotten saints. And the crucifix above the altar twisted violently, not away from the congregation, but toward it, as if even Christ wanted to see what was about to happen. Sister Amara stood, her hands still warm with ink, her belly trembling as though the verse inside her wanted out. But it wasn't time. Not yet. The earth and candles wouldn't light. Prayers evaporated the moment they were spoken. And Father Eliar, now only a hollow shell of memory, raised his arms and whispered a name no one recognized. Riyaf, not a demon, not an angel, but something in between, a reader of divine errors, a watcher of verses never meant to exist. And when that name echoed through the pews, the eyes of every statue in the cathedral bled. Samuel collapsed. The villagers dropped to their knees, not in worship, but in instinct. Something entered, not through the door, but through the silence. A pulse, a presence, a rawness that couldn't be shed but felt inside the bones. It walked without form, and yet everyone saw it in their own reflection. If only for a blink. Sister Amara fell to her knees, her mouth opened, not to scream but to recite. The verse must be finished before the child draws breath, or what waits between pages will write again. But something interrupted her. A scream from the bell tower. An unknown who hadn't spoken in years was ringing the bells with her bare hands. Tearing her palms open on the rope, she screamed down to them, "He want tea, look! He want tea, look!" And when they ran up to her, she had gouged out her own eyes and scrawled across the wall in blood, "Even God has turned his face." Episode 8, the birth that wasn't human. They thought they had more time, but the verse didn't wait. It never asked permission. By the next dusk, Sister Amara was no longer speaking, only trembling, mouth half open as if reciting something only the unborn could hear. She lay on the chapel floor, surrounded by holy relics that had begun to hum, not in harmony. In morning, outside, the sky refused to darken, not because the sun remained, but because something blacker than night was holding the heavens shut. And inside her, the birth began. No midwife, no cries of pain, only silence. A silence so deep it swallowed the ticking of clocks, the whispers of prayers, even the sound of hearts beating. Father Elias, still hollow, still watching, knelt beside her. His voice was low, reverent, The verse has chosen its flesh. Amara's body arched, stiff and still, like a crucifix caught mid-resurrection. And then she breathed out, one long, cold exhale, and something slid from her that was not a child. It did not cry. It pulsed. It shimmered like ink in water, shifting, forming vague limbs that twitched but never moved with purpose. The villagers, though still brave enough to remain, stared in frowning awe, and then they heard it, a voice, but not from the thing, from everywhere, every mouthing, "Old believer." Elder opened at once, and from all lips came the same line, "We are the margins." The entity turned, not with a head, but with intent, and where its gaze fell, the world blurred, would rotted instantly, pages curled to ash, faith cracked like thin ice under the weight of meaning. Sister Amara, still alive, reached out not toward her child, but toward the crucifix. She whispered, "I didn't carry a life, I carried a sentence." And in that moment, the verse began to rewrite the church. Walls shifted, symbols reversed, and in the book on the altar every other verse vanished, except one, the one God regretted, and now it had a voice. Episode 9, the scripture that spoke back. It was never meant to speak. Scripture was made to be read, interpreted, preached, not to answer. But that night, the Bible on the altar turned its own pages. The congregation where remained of it stood frowning as the pages flipped without wind, without hands, each one blackened, lines vanishing as if consumed from the inside out, until it stopped. One page, one verse, and then it spoke, not with sound, but with memory. Each person in the chapel felt it at once a moment from their past, rewritten in real time, a betrayal that never happened, a kiss that turned into a blade, a prayer once answered, now denied. The verse wasn't giving prophecy, it was editing reality. Sister Amara, pale and trembling, clutched her abdomen, now hollow. She looked at the increature child as it hovered inches above the book, pulsing with lightless energy, and the book spoke again, but this time, with Eliah's voice. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word changed its mind." Suddenly, the air split not like a scream, but like paper being torn, and from the tear, something emerged. It was not a demon, not an angel, but a shape made of rejected prayers. Wings formed from crossed-out psalms, eyes filled with forgotten confessions. It hovered above the altar, looking down at the verse child like a father meeting his mistake. It didn't speak, it judged, and all around them, the symbols of faith reacted. The crucifix turned away, the holy water boiled, and every Bible in the pews opened on its own, displaying the same page, now burned at the edges. This verse is not divine, it is a wound. The entity raised one hand, reaching for the ink child, but it recoiled, not in fear, but in defiance. And from its body, a new line wrote itself into the air. Wounds don't ask for healing, they become doors. The entity paused, and then, without a sound, it knelt. Episode 10, the door that leads to no heaven. There was no lock, no handle, no frame, just a door carved into the air like a scar across reality. It stood where the altar had been, pulsing with a light that wasn't light at all, but memory. A door formed not by God, nor by man, but by regret. The verse child hovered before it, silent now, its form more solid than before, almost human. Almost. The creature made from discarded prayers still knelt beside it, head bowed, trembling. No one dared move. Even Eliah, what was left of him, stood frowning in the aisle, as if waiting for permission to breathe. And then, the door opened, not outward, not inward. It opened into them. Every person in the room felt it at once, a cold rushing inside their thoughts, a sensation like being remembered by something that had never met them. Father Tomas, one of the elders, clutched his chest. He gasped. "I saw it," he whispered. "I saw a place where angels crawl and cry like children." Others began to speak in tongues, not heavenly, not demonic, but unfinished, the kind of language only a regret could write. The door did not show fire, or light, or judgment. It showed scripture that had been erased. Verses too dangerous to teach, too painful to keep, too honest to be holy, and written across the threshold. In the original ink of the first verse ever spoken were 7 words. He created light to forget this place. The meaning was clear. This was not hell. This was what heaven refused to name. Sister Amara stepped forward. Her eyes, once gentle, were now mirror-like, reflecting not the world, but the wounds beneath it. I was never chosen, she said softly. I was just available. And then she turned to them, all of them. It's not a birth, it's a return. The verse child entered the door, and as it passed through, the door didn't close. It inverted. It became a passage, not to the divine, but to what the divine tried to bury. And now, the door knew them all by name. Episode 11. The names that were never written in the book of life. The Bible had always spoken of names written in the book of life, but it never mentioned the ones that were left out. Names whispered but never recorded, spoken in fear, erased in shame. Names that belonged to souls God never claimed and maybe never intended to. But now, the book was bleeding. Is Saturday open on the altar once more, if it could still be called an altar, as pages soaked with black red ink that moved like veins. One by one, names appeared, names no one in the chapel recognized, except themselves. Amara's name appeared first, not spelled, but sung, a melody that made her fall to her knees, not in awe, in horror. I don't want it back, she whispered. I buried that name when I took the veil. Then Samuel's name rose next, etched in the margins, trembling like it didn't belong on the page. He clutched his chest, tears falling soundlessly. They never baptized me, he whispered. They were afraid of what I'd remember. Others began to scream. Each page turned on its own, revealing more and more named, shrill names, not the ones they had carried in the world. Names that came from the spaces between words, from the pauses between prayers, from the silence that filled the sky when heaven had nothing to say. The door still stood, humming with unseen voices, and behind it, the verse child had stopped. It turned. It had no mouth, but they all heard it. The book never forgot. It was told to stay silent. The creature made from discarded prayers began to disintegrate, its wings falling off like burnt paper, its eyes closing for the first and only time. The names kept appearing, and then they reached Elijah. His true name did not appear. Instead, where it should have been, the page tore itself, ripped open in the shape of a void. Because some names were never lost, they were rejected. He stared at the tear, and from it came the final whisper of the night. Those without a name in the book are not forgotten. They are returned to the verse. And as the wind began to rise, carrying torn pages into the pews, everyone realized something far more terrifying than hell. Heaven remembers what it chooses not to forgive. Episode 12. The verse that will be read after the world ends. It is said the world will end in fire, or flood, or silence. But that night, in a chapel where faith had unraveled and verses had bled, the world ended in a sentence. One final sentence. The young child, now standing fully formed yet without a soul, stared at the open door. It had created a door shaped not by time or space, but by memory denied by divinity. And then it turned, not to flee, not to stay, but to read. The torn page in the book began to mend, not with parchment but with breath. A living page, a final verse. The room filled with wind, though the windows were shut. Every candle lit at once, then extinguished, leaving only the voice of the verse child. And it read, in the beginning, there was the Word, and in the end, there was what he wished he hadn't spoken. The walls cracked, not from pressure but from recognition. Reality thin, exhausted, bent. People didn't scream. They remembered. Every moment they weren't chosen. Every prayer that went unanswered. Every silence that had teeth. Sister Amara collapsed, not from pain, but from completion. Her purpose was never motherhood. It was delivery. She had birthed not a child, but the final punctuation. The ink child stepped into the center of the chapel, lifted its hand, and pointed upward. The ceiling turned transparent. And above them, heaven looked away, not in wrath, not in judgment, in regret, the kind of regret that echoes long after the author is gone. Then, the verse child did what no prophet, no priest, no angel ever dared. It spoke a second line. We are not what he forgot. We are what he tried to bury in himself. And the sky cracked. No trumpet, no rapture, just pages raining from the heavens, torn from books never meant to open. The final image, seared into every heart pressed. A verse with no end, just an open space. waiting for the next reader. Epilogue. When heaven asked for silence, no one speaks of the chapel anymore. Not because they forgot, but because heaven asked them to. Not in thunder, not in flame, but in silence. A silence so deep, it pressed against their lungs like prayer turned to ash. That church still stands, but it is no longer consecrate. No priest dares approach. The doors remain open up by human hands, but by fear that closing them might mean finishing what the verse started. Those who survived, they walk differently now, like their shadows move half a second delayed, like their names don't belong to them anymore. Samuel never spoke again. Sister Amara was found kneeling in the forest weeks later, whispering into the dirt, planting rosary beads like seeds. And Elijah, no one ever saw him leave the church, but some say they see him at night reflected in windows he never stood before, whispering the verse backward, trying to undo what was born. But the verse is alive now. It's not a chapter, it's a choice. And every time someone prays, they risk reading it, not aloud, but within. It waits, not in books, not in churches, in regret and heaven. Heaven has not spoken since, because even God, it seems, cannot unwrite what was written in sorrow, and what was written in sorrow always finds a voice, the final word. If you ever find a Bible with one page burned in the middle, one verse written by no hand you recognize, and no number beside it, don't read it, don't speak it, and above all, don't believe you were meant to find it.